This is Get Uncomfortable, the podcast where we talk race, politics, religion, and so much more with me, Adam Smith. I always say whether you view the Bible as a faith or life book, the lessons are real. One life lesson comes from the story of Joseph in the Old Testament book of Genesis. Many people know Joseph's amazing Technicolor dreamcoat, but only some know his story as finding purpose no matter what people threw at him. Today, we're going to have some biblical shop talk about applying Joseph's life lessons of finding our purpose and opportunities, no matter life's prisons, to our daily lives with my friend and brother, Tim Sutherland. Tim is a licensed counselor, executive coach, and consultant who works with leaders and nonprofit organizations across the country and around the world. He is a graduate of Fuller Theological Seminary and Milligan University and holds a graduate certificate in leadership studies from Johnson University. He is a third-generational, non-denominational pastor and published author. Tim has 2 grown sons, 1 grandbaby, and hails from Knoxville, Tennessee. Tim, welcome. Thank you for joining us for some biblical shop talk. How you doing, man?
Better than humans should be allowed, or rather better than humans should be allowed.
I appreciate you taking the time to talk about a topic that you and I have talked about offline for months. And we wanted to make sure to give a shout out to the Bishop, T.D. Jakes, for his sermon, Our Prison is Not Our Problem, right? Because that also has helped frame this conversation. But we wanted to really talk about, and whether you're a believer that the Bible is a faith book, or at the end of the day, it's just kind of the greatest life book that's ever been known to exist in the world. We wanted to use Joseph's life as an example to kind of talk about our life circumstances and all these prisons that we're in, not being our problem, but having additional purpose and opportunities in these spaces. So can you help us? Because when I think back on Joseph's life, we think about 4 phases of life. And we know, even if you're not a Bible person, you know the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, the play, right? And that is all about Joseph. So talk a little
Donny
bit.
Osmond, depending on how you look at it.
Or Donnie, yes. So talk a little bit about these phases of Joseph's life, kind of walk us through his life story, maybe the first 2 phases, and why he's such an important biblical figure.
Again, thanks for having me, Adam. Love it. Love this podcast, and welcome to all of our listeners, wherever you may be. Glad you're with us. Why talk about Joseph? Well, Joseph is of very important historical significance because he is the son of Jacob, who is the son of Abraham. And if you know anything about world religions, you know that the 3 primary monotheistic religions in the history of the world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all consider Abraham, who is the grandfather of Joseph, to be their primary patriarch. In fact, and for those of you who are into Rastafarianism is considered an Abrahamic religion because it traces its story back through Abraham. And so Abraham is the father of Jacob, and Jacob's the father of Joseph. So Joseph is the grandson, the grandbaby of the great Abraham. So regardless of whether this topic that we're talking about tonight applies to you or not, and I tell you what I believe. I believe that this topic either has applied to you in the past, or applies to you now, or it's gonna apply to you sometime in the future. I think those are the only 3 possibilities if you're a human like the rest of us. So stick with us, even if you go, I don't know, I don't relate to this. Oh, you might someday. You might. I didn't always relate to it, but I do now. So phase 1 of Joseph's life, he is one of 11 sons of Jacob. And in phase 1 of his life, he is daddy's boy. He is the favored son of the great Jacob. And this is how he gets the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's interesting. The scripture doesn't actually call it a coat of many colors. That's actually a slight mistranslation from the King James Version. What it really means literally in the Hebrew is a coat with very long sleeves, kind of like wizard sleeves. But here was the significance of that. A coat of really long sleeves would make it impossible for him to do manual labor. And his family, they were shepherds and agriculturalists. And he's given the coat of the coat of many colors, aka the coat with the really long sleeves, too fancy to work in.
Well, and less about, just to remind folks, it was less about jealousy over this fancy coat that Joseph had that the brothers didn't have. It was jealousy that Joseph didn't have to work in the same way. He didn't have to work the fields, and he was treated differently as the baby boy, the apple of Jacob's eye, more than the other brothers felt like they were.
Yeah. And many of y'all listening know how painful it is when there's favoritism in a family. Maybe you had a favorited brother or sister and you know how much that hurts. Or maybe you were the favored brother or sister, the favored son or daughter, and you know what kind of consternation and division it caused. And so what we see is that the great Jacob, who's the son of the great father of all the monotheistic religions, major monotheistic religions in the world today, Abraham, yeah, it's also a greatly dysfunctional family. It says clearly in Scripture that his other brothers hated him. They weren't just irked or miffed or put off or frustrated or bothered. They hated his ever-living guts. And Joseph doesn't help things, because Joseph starts having dreams. And in one of his dreams, I'll just condense it. He has two dreams. And in each of these dreams, everybody in his family, including all of his brothers and his father and his mother, are bowing down to him in his dreams. And check out what Joseph does, y'all. Joseph goes to his brothers and goes, "Hey, man, let me tell you about this crazy dream I had." Man, this is beyond tone deaf.
Right. Well, and imagine if your little brother, little sister, who is already getting favor from a parent, then comes and says, "Well, I had this dream, right? that you're going to bow down before me, and I'm going to be, you're going to be basically kissing the hem of my robe," right? So his brothers are incensed. So Tim, remind us what happened. So there's a traumatic event with what happens in this point where it kind of alters not just Joseph's life, all religious lives after that. Talk about what happens next.
His brothers are so incensed. They already hate him, but they hated him all the more when he starts talking this talk about these dreams. And so his brothers decide to kill him. And hatred turns to murderous intent. And so they take him and they throw him in a cistern, essentially a dry well, and they're going to kill him. But before they can kill him, the oldest brother, Reuben, comes along and says, "No, we can't kill him. We can't kill him. Let's sell him into slavery. We'll make a buck or two off this little so-and-so, and we'll just smear some blood on that fancy long-sleeved robe. And we'll tell Dad that he's dead and the wild animal got him out in the pasture someplace. Dad'll be none the wiser, and we'll have some money in our pocket, and we'll be rid of that little son of a." And so that's what they do. They sell their own brother into slavery, and they cook up this story, this big lie that he's been killed by a wild animal, and his dad and Jacob is none the wiser. And of course, Jacob is bereft because his favored son is now dead as far as he knows. And Joseph is sold to traveling slave traders. History of slavery, oh my gosh, goes way, 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 way back. So he's sold to slave traders that are passing through, and they're on their way to Egypt, and he is now their property. And this is when he's 17 years old. From 0 to 17 years old, he's the favored son of the great Abraham. And then at 17, he is sold into slavery by his own brothers. And now he is the property of slave traders. And then they end up selling him in Egypt to a guy by the name of Potiphar, who was a high official in Pharaoh's court. Now, it says that Potiphar was in charge of Pharaoh's dungeon, which doesn't sound like a very glamorous job. But no, the king's dungeon was where you put the great enemies of the king. It was like the highest security prison in all of, so think Guantanamo Bay. Think the highest security prison possible. And it's the guy who runs that prison, or essentially the warden of the high security political prisoner center of Egypt, is now become his master.
Yeah, I always think about Potiphar kind of as a Secret Service top guy.
Oh, gosh,
right?
yeah.
Because he is not only protecting the Pharaoh and we'll talk more about Pharaoh in a second, but Pharaoh literally was, in the minds of Egyptians and in their religion, Pharaoh was God, right? Mm-hmm. And so you are protecting God from his enemies. And that's who Potiphar was. And so Joseph is sold as a slave to Potiphar, and this becomes his first prison, right?
Yeah. Because now he is officially the chattel property of one of the highest ranking officials in all of Egypt. But even in his first experience of being imprisoned in chattel slavery, Joseph uses his God-given gifts. He's seen as a great manager, as a great leader, and Potiphar ends up putting him in charge of his whole household. And so Joseph is still a slave. Joseph is still in prison. But there's no talk of Joseph getting out of slavery. There is just him using his God-given gifts to prosper and benefit others. And in this case, the person he's benefiting is Potiphar and his family.
Well, and thinking about these prisons, right? Mm-hmm. And seeing the prison, it was like Joseph he went from being this favored son without a callus on his hands to being, I can't imagine the betrayal of feeling like my brothers, right, who I love, sold me into slavery, but his mindset, right? We can get to Carol Dweck and growth mindset, but Joseph never feels like he's in prison.
No,
he never feels like he's a slave.
He's prospering.
Yes. And his prison, right, isn't just where he feels like he's not there. It's an opportunity to use his gifts, right?
Yeah.
And it's opportunity to use his God-given purpose.
Yeah. So obviously when he becomes a slave, he doesn't act or carry him like a slave. He doesn't just put his head down and just try to keep his head down and stay out of trouble. There's no talk, there's no mention of him mourning over the fact that he is the prisoner of chattel slavery. He's using his God-given gifts. See, he's focused on his purpose because he knows that his prison is not his problem.
Right.
His prison is not his problem. And what he's focused on is being who God meant him to be, even while he's a slave. Man, if you look at the history of African Americans in the American South, in the antebellum American South, and you see the rich history of spirituals, this was not some sort of escapist, worldly denying thing. No, this was, they knew who they were, even though they had been taken from where they belonged and had everything stripped from them, including their original given names.
Yeah.
And yet there was deep joy as well as deep pain in their lives. And it was because they knew who they were. Because even slavery in the antebellum South couldn't keep them from being the spiritual beings that they were.
That's right.
And they had a spirituality that their slave holders, their quote unquote masters, couldn't take away from them, even with manacles and a bullwhip.
Well, and it's thinking about the spiritual, right? Soon I will be done with the problems of this world. right? That is basically saying my prison isn't my problem.
Nope.
It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to think bigger and broader. So now Joseph, right, after the age of 17 is running Potiphar's household.
Yep.
Not only Potiphar, so this is like the 4-star, 5-star general of
Mm-hmm.
God, not an elected official, the Pharaoh,
Mm-hmm.
God. He's running not the prisons, his literal household. So
Which would
then
mean his entire estate.
everything. So then something crazy happens because
Mm.
again, it's once again Joseph's eyes are on opportunity, his eyes are on purposefulness, his
Mhm.
eyes on his gifts and what to do with them, and the world, whether you believe the world or the devil or whatever, humankind comes in and tries to distract him again his
Mhm.
problem being with his prison being his problem, and it comes in the form of the wife of Potiphar. Talk about that.
Everything's going along fairly well, very well for Joseph, despite the fact that he is imprisoned in chattel slavery. And Potiphar's wife takes notice. And Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him to get him to have sex with her. And here's what's really important to note. In those days, in those times, that's what the lady of the house could do if she wanted. So it wasn't like, shh, come in here and let's get busy. No, it wasn't like that. It was like, come here, son. I can have what I want in this household. And see, when Potiphar entrusted Joseph with his entire estate, he also entrusted him with his wife because he was watching out and taking care of her too, as the man in charge of Potiphar's whole shooting match there. And so Potiphar's wife says, "Come on in here and let's just do what the lady of the house gets to do with whoever she wants to do it with." And the husband either looks the other way, and it's really interesting what Joseph says. Joseph says, "I can't do this thing. I can't do this thing to God or to Potiphar." He remains loyal to the man who has enslaved him,
Mm.
who has imprisoned him in chattel slavery by buying him from the slaveholders who bought him from his murderous, hateful, insidious brothers. And yet Joseph is still like going, "No, I can't do this thing." And Potiphar's wife, she doesn't just say, "Well, sucks to be you." She doesn't say that. No, she tries to take him by force. And she grabs him by his cloak, and he struggles physically, and he goes running from the room, and he is buck naked. And then Potiphar's wife realizes, "Ooh, this little scamp won't have me. Who does he think he is? He's a slave. I'm the mighty Potiphar's wife, and he's not going to sleep with me when I say come here." And so she cries rape. And when Potiphar's wife cries rape, nobody cares about Joseph's story. And the scripture doesn't even say that Joseph protested and proclaimed his own innocence. It just, because it's fait accompli that he is guilty as charged, because when the master's wife charges a slave with something and everybody has seen him running from her chambers naked as the day he was born, who are they going to believe? The slaveholder's wife or the slave? Well, so now Potiphar, who just happens to be in charge of the king's dungeon, guess who he puts in the king's special dungeon, in the king's own high security political prison? Now our guy Joseph. Now Joseph is in literal prison. He goes from a de facto prison of chattel slavery. He goes to being actually imprisoned in the highest security prison in all of Egypt. And remember, at this time, Egypt is the mightiest. It is the mightiest empire, the mightiest political entity and economic entity in the world. and in fact, probably that the world has ever seen up to this time. And now Joseph is a literal prisoner in a literal prison.
Mm. When back to
Which is part two of phase two. Part one of phase two was when he's running Potiphar's household. Part two of phase two is now he is a literal prisoner in a literal prison.
Mm. When we think about, you were talking about, comparing this slavery to slavery in the United States. Those are the same. It's the reason why Black Americans, I always say Black is a people, not a race, because when you look at Black Americans, we don't look like West Africans, right? Because of the colonization, because of the rape of Black women, and not just Black women, Black men. Yeah, these same things were happening. It was the reason why people were taking certain slaves. Was just because you could just have sex with anybody you wanted to. The depravity that was happening, and how dare Joseph reject that? So then Joseph goes into literal prison. So tell us about phase three. So Joseph goes from figurative or prison of slavery to now physical prison. But the thing about Joseph, and I want to keep y'all on this, Joseph's outlook remains the same. Right?
What does he do in prison? In prison, he shows that his God-given gifts as a manager, as a leader, are still intact. So he gets made into the chief prisoner of the prison.
Yes.
He goes from being slave of Potiphar to running everything for Potiphar, and he goes from being a prisoner in the prison to the head prisoner, like essentially if prisoners had a board of trustees, he was the chairman of the board. So he's running the show in the prison, and see, this is him exercising his God-given gifts. And see, Joseph, despite all of this crap, all of this stuff that people have thrown his way, his brothers, first his dad does him wrong by treating him as a favorite, and then his brothers do him wrong, and then Potiphar does him wrong by buying him in the first place. Then Potiphar's wife does him real wrong. But what does he do? All these people in very many ways who are imprisoning him, you know what? It doesn't say he wasn't bothered or he was unfazed. What it says is that he was somebody who knew that whatever his prison wasn't his problem. Because he knew not just the day he was born, he knew why. And part of it had to do with being just Patrick Lencioni level manager, leader, organizational genius in his God-given gifts. And so he's not languishing in prison. He is flourishing in prison.
Right.
And think about that. When I'm in prison, I can either languish or I can flourish. And I can flourish when I know that my prison is not my problem. Because the biggest problem in anybody's life is purposelessness.
Because even in those spaces, Joseph, have to know why we're here. And there are spaces, right, that I always say you're going to be where you're going to be till you're not, right? And we want things to move faster. We want to go from this prison to what we see as getting out of prison. And we think that's the most important thing. I got to get out of prison. I got to get out of prison. And don't get me wrong. I don't mean that we shouldn't try to get out of our prisons if we can. But if we think the most important thing we can do is get out of prison, we might be fighting the wrong battle. And when you fight the wrong battle, how are you going to win the war? That's right.
I can't win the war if I fight the wrong battle. I might get myself out of prison and think, oh, if only I can get up out of here. If only I can get out of this prison. And let's just talk about the various prisons that we might find ourselves in. It's possible that we have brothers and sisters who are behind literal bars who are listening to this podcast, but maybe you're in another kind of prison. Maybe you're in the prison of just a stale, bad marriage. Now, I don't mean an abusive marriage where you're in danger. I don't mean that, but just a stale, unsatisfying, or hurtful marriage, and you feel like this marriage is a prison to me. Are you in prison today? Or maybe it's a job. Maybe you feel stuck in this particular job and you don't see any way out of it. Are you in prison today? Or maybe it's in debt. Maybe you're in debtor's prison. Now, not literal debtor's prison like medieval England or colonial New England or something, but maybe the debtor's prison of you look at the mountain of debt, credit card debt, house debt, medical debt, and you go, there is no way I'll ever get out of this. I'll be paying on this till I am dead. I will never get out of here. And we can become obsessed with getting out of debt, like getting out of debt is the most important thing in our lives. And then our purpose for living comes in getting out of debt. But keep in mind, your prison is not your problem. And if just getting out of prison is what you're about, is what you're fighting for, you might be fighting the wrong battle. Because see, God doesn't have to get you out of prison to give you victory over your problems.
And sometimes when we're so focused on the prison being, if I just get out of this relationship, or I just get out of this job, or I just get out of this, or I just do, if this just happens, and then we end up taking the prison with us.
Absolutely. And see, your prison is not your problem. Your prison, we see in the life of Joseph, your prison can become your platform.
Yes.
Your prison can become your platform. Well, and so Joseph uses his prison as his platform for using his God-given gifts, because they can't take that away from him, no matter how deep, dark a dungeon they throw his behind in. So he's in prison, and he's got this other gift in addition to management, leadership, and just being stellar at that. Remember how badly he offended his brothers with his dreams. Well, he not only had these symbolic, powerful dreams, he was also had the God-given gift of interpreting dreams. And in this prison are these two characters that we meet in the book of Genesis. One is the king's cupbearer, the guy who served the king his wine. And don't think like sommelier. Think like another highly trusted personal guard, because the cupbearer is the one who tasted the king's wine to make sure nobody poisoned it. Because if the cupbearer tastes it and he doesn't die, or he knows that it doesn't have the taste of poison, then it's okay for the king. So the cupbearer was entrusted with the king's very life. So he's in the political prison. He's in the high security prison, the king's cupbearer. And also the king's chief baker is in there with Joseph. And the chief baker is, whoever is the chef at the White House is a big deal. And for the rest of his life, he can put on his curriculum vitae that he was the chef at the White House. And so the king's chief baker, these two guys had somehow gotten sideways of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and they end up in prison with Joseph. And Joseph knows that his prison is not his problem. His prison is his platform, and it's the place from which he can exercise his God-given gifts. And one of his God-given gifts is interpreting dreams. And this chief baker and cupbearer of Pharaoh have these dreams. And Joseph says, hey, let me help you out, because God's given me the gift of interpreting dreams, and I'll interpret your dreams. Now, it was a good news, bad news sort of scenario, because the good news for the cupbearer is that he was going to get out of prison. That's what his symbolic, cryptic dream meant. And the bad news was for the chief baker, because his dream meant that he was not going to get out of there, that he was going to be executed. And sure enough, he was speaking not just like a psychologist interpreting dreams, but more like a prophetic ability to interpret dreams. And the cupbearer gets out of prison, and the chief baker loses his head, literally. Now, see, Joseph is not like, I don't care if I'm in prison. Joseph still wants out of prison. And he says to the cupbearer, ooh, when you get back to Pharaoh's court, remember me, which means put a good word in for me with the big man, because I'm the one. But the cupbearer gets out and he forgets all about Joseph until the big man, Pharaoh himself, God incarnate, according to Egyptian religiosity, has this dream. And he has no idea what it means. He just knows it's significant. And he's telling his cupbearer all about it because he trusts his cupbearer with his life. So he's telling his cupbearer his problems, not unlike you might tell a bartender your problems. And he goes, what does this dream mean? And the cupbearer goes, I don't know, but you know what? I knew this cat in jail. And come to think of it, he had a special supernatural gift for interpreting dreams. And Pharaoh is intrigued. And Pharaoh calls Joseph up out of the prison and says, interpret my dream. And Joseph says, your dream means that there's going to be 7 years of bumper crops. And then there's going to be 7 years of famine. There's going to be 7 years of recession, depression. And Pharaoh's like, well, what do I do? And Joseph goes, well, what you do is you start saving up from these years of plenty. And so guess what? Guess who gets put in charge of it all once again? It happened in Potiphar's house. It happened in prison. And now it's happening in Pharaoh's court. And Joseph is made vizier. Joseph is made prime minister, Pharaoh's right-hand man, in charge of everything in Egypt. Amazing. All because Joseph was a man, Joseph was a human who knew that his prison was never his problem. Purposelessness is always the greatest problem that can befall a person. And he knew his prison wasn't his problem, and now he's in charge of the whole shooting match of the greatest empire in the freaking world. Are you kidding me, Adam? Are you kidding me? He's the victim of attempted fratricide. He's sold into chattel slavery. He's put in prison on an actual prison on trumped up charges, on false accusation, fake charges, and then he ends up the second most powerful man on the planet, all because he knew his prison wasn't his problem. It was his platform from which he could exercise his purpose.
See what we're talking about? So whether it is faith book or life book or both, this is the kind of thing that self-help experts have been writing about for hundreds of years, selling. Just this story alone, when you apply it to our daily lives, is really, really, really powerful. So phase 4, okay? So at some point, people now have to come to visit with Pharaoh and to see his prime minister.
Yeah.
And guess who ends up showing up?
Yeah. Because see, Egypt was the only one through the leadership of Joseph who had the foresight and the vision and the prudence and the efficiency to save up from 7 years of bumper crops. So when famine comes, they're holding all the cards because they're holding all the grain.
That's right.
And so people are coming from far and wide to beg grain from Pharaoh. And guess who comes a calling?
That's right. That's right. So tell this story to folks, because this is an example, and I've talked about this in other podcasts, but shout out to Jack Becker at Rock Valley College, who said to me one day, first thing he said was, you know what's wrong with you? And I said, oh, Lord, here we go. And then he began to talk about, well, when we were in this meeting with these other campus leaders, you proved your point. And then you dropped an elbow. You know how when you prove your point in a room, or you get a colleague to see your point of view, or a partner or somebody you're in relationship with, and then you feel like you have to drive it home. Mm-hmm. And Jack said, not only did you lose that person, you lost the room, because no one likes a bully. And so Joseph does a really good job of making sure his brothers know, but he also kind of lets them up. And there's
Oh,
classness.
it is fascinating. I'm a counselor. The psychology of this is fascinating because when his brothers are sent to him, here's the next plot twist. He recognizes them instantly.
And they don't
But guess who
recognize
doesn't
him.
recognize him?
That's right.
So they just think he's an Egyptian, but he knows who they are, but they don't know who he is. So Joseph plays dumb. First of all, he's overcome with emotion when he sees them, but then he starts messing with them. When he gives them some grain and he sends them back home, but he puts the money they paid him for the grain in the sacks. So they go home with their money and their grain, and they get home and they freak out because they think, oh no, he's going to come up short in his bookkeeping, and he's going to think that we shortchanged him, or that we somehow pulled the old switcheroo and we left town we left town with both his grain and our money. And so they go back, and they're kissing up to him and going, hey, there's some mistakes been made. And he goes, no. I want you to have it. Go head on back home. And this time he puts his own the king's cup, the silver chalice of the king, in one of the bags of grain. He plants it in there, and they get home and they find the king sitting there and go, oh no, he's going to think we stole it. And he says, and so they go on back and see, he knows who they are, but they still don't know who he is. And so he goes back and forth between messing with them, but also then having to leave the room because he's overwhelmed with emotion. And you got to think,
right.
This is the phase 4 starts when he's 30. So 13 years have passed. He was in prison. Most scholars will say he was in prison for 12 or 13 years. It's been 13 years since he's seen his brothers, but he's still overcome with emotion. But then he's messing with them, and then he's overcome with emotion, and then he's messing with them.
Well, and part of the messing with them, and I think you and I know, part of the messing with them is forcing them to have to come back to see him again.
Yeah.
Right? So he isn't messing with them to twist the knife, as some people would think. He's messing with them to force them to have to come back and see him again. Force them to come back and see him again, to see if God, the Holy Spirit themselves, they would recognize him. Again, this is an opportunity of Joseph showing grace to them. Yeah. So he isn't doing this in a way to needle them or to upset them. He's doing this not to drop the elbow. He's doing this to let them up off the mat. So he keeps bringing them, because they would have never known if at the first time he took the money and they all went off and it was over. He would have been the only one that knew, but he was trying to teach and show them some grace. Through all of this,
that's where this is going, until finally he drops the facade. He stops the charade, as it were, where he's going along with them, thinking he's a powerful Egyptian, and he lets them know who he is, and they are scared because they know what they've done to him. They know what they've done to him. And the road that they traveled going back and forth between their homeland in Egypt is the same road that they made him travel as a slave. He's reminding them. He has reminded them, in effect, of what they had done to him. And they think that this is all a prelude, because he has the power of life and death over them. He could have just nodded his head and it would have been off with theirs. But it's interesting what he says. It's one of my favorite verses of all scripture. He talks about what they did to him. And he says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, for the saving of many lives. Because not only did it result in all those people who had grain, because Joseph had used his God-given gifts of management and leadership to store up grain to get the world through a famine, his brothers go back to where dad is and brings the whole family, the whole family down to Egypt, and saves their lives from famine. And not only are their lives saved from famine, but then the offspring of Abraham and Jacob prosper in Egypt.
Mm.
And they become a great people. They were put in charge of Pharaoh's own flocks. So they were like in charge of the sheep and the goats and the camels and the livestock of the Pharaoh, and that was everything. And they prospered, and generations of the descendants of Abraham and Jacob not only were saved from famine, but they prospered to great wealth, great prosperity in the kingdom of Egypt.
Mm. Mm. Well, and Tim, this is such a powerful lesson. And we talked about this a little bit, but talk about some of those figurative prisons that we're in. Especially, we talked about some things, but for some of us, it's work or it's school or it's whatever. How do we apply these lessons of Joseph? How do we find our purpose in those places that we feel are the problem? But it isn't the one thing we always say. Say this to students, say this to colleagues. You say this in your practice, that the one person you're going to take from this prison is yourself.
Yeah. Wherever you go, there you are.
And if you aren't finding purpose before, it doesn't matter where your feet or your body be, right? And so finding purpose in life's prisons, talk about that.
And see, if this seems like too much rah-rah and too much, Tony Robbins-esque sort of hype, let me just tell one of my heroes of the 20th century who knew something about prisons. Viktor Frankl was one of the preeminent psychiatrists of the 20th century, and Viktor Frankl was in Nazi Germany, and he was a Jew during the Hitler regime, and he was imprisoned. And I'm pretty sure that he was in Auschwitz. He was either in Auschwitz or Dachau. I think it was Auschwitz. But he's in prison in a death camp, in a concentration camp, in the most evil place on earth, Hitler's concentration death camp for Jews and Poles and Czechs and various other people group, but primarily for Jews. And Viktor Frankl became fascinated as a doctor with the prisoners in Auschwitz who thrived compared to the prisoners in Auschwitz who just basically languished and perished. And he studied it, and what he saw was that the ones who actually thrived in the concentration camp, despite their great suffering, didn't get more food. They weren't necessarily healthier coming in. They didn't have any sort of, super immune kind of thing to where they were like not affected by the rigors and the horrors of a concentration camp. What he found was the ones who survived and even thrived in even the horrors of a concentration camp, he called them the ones who had a why. Not why they were in a concentration camp, but why they were on this earth. And he came up with this saying, and he said, a man can endure any what as long as he has his why. And see, that's not Tony Robbins talking. That's a man in a concentration camp.
When I think your point is so good, it's so good that realizing that it isn't why you are in this prison. It's why you exist.
Why you're on this earth.
Right?
The day you were born and the day you find out why.
And it's okay to own your why, right? Because no one else will.
If you have like no idea what your why is, first of all, let's do this. To know that your prison is not your problem, the first thing you got to do is spot the lie that getting what you want in life circumstantially is the key to happiness. It's just not. The great playwright and satirist Oscar Wilde said the two worst fates that can befall a person: not getting what you want, and getting it.
Getting what you want.
See, we know this from the research. Only about 10% of our so-called happiness or unhappiness is attributable to our circumstances after the initial shock or uptick from the really, really good news or the really, really bad news.
And one of the things I'll share with y'all that Tim gave me is this idea of taking stock of impact every day.
Mm-hmm.
You know, especially when you're in a prison that is, let's just say it's a work situation. And you're like, oh my gosh, why am I here? I can't stand, I want to go somewhere else. I just want to change it. But again, that prison, right? It's not your problem. And so what I try to do every day is take stock. I have a notebook in my desk, and every day I write down, I call it my impact notebook.
Nice.
So in that day, I write down what impact I had. But I don't just write down the impact I had, I write down why. And not why did I make an impact, but why am I recognizing that? Does that make sense? So taking the time and really reflecting, not just on, oh, I had this impact on this person's life today or this situation, but why that was brought to the forefront of my mind. And so on those days when I am feeling purposeless, reflecting back on those times where I made an impact, but less important in the impact made, but why I recognized it at that point in time. Like, why was that the thing? Because that's who we are as humans. There's times that we just want the pain to stop. And we think, you know, I shout out to my great friend, colleague, sister, Teresa Radomski-Bamba. And there was a time we were going through a prison when we were at an institution together. And she said, I just don't know if I can keep doing this. This is too much. And we were standing back to back, her, myself, some colleagues, and we were like literally on our own version of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Tim. And, you know, Teresa is not a woman of color. So she hasn't learned just innately in the DNA how to coalition build and how to fight the power and do these things. And so one day we were talking and she said, I just want it to be over. And I said, I know. It's like you got your hand over the flame of a candle. And all you do is you're feeling the burn and you're sweating and it's singeing and you smell it. And you're like, I want anything but for this to go away. And then somebody comes and moves the candle. But because you want real change and real justice, you move your hand back. Because without the pain of that situation, you can't come to the point of change. And so getting these pieces to understand and to figure out our purposefulness and our platform, seeing those prisons that all of us are in, whether it's relationships, whether it's medical issues, whether it's debt, whether it's a job, whether it's a situation, that is the platform for you to use the purpose that God, Jehovah, Allah, higher power, the universe has bestowed on you. That is our charge for everyone today. Kim, leave us with any additional nuggets for people to take away. How do we take this story of Joseph and put it into action in our day-to-day lives so we find purpose and a platform and an opportunity for whatever prisons life has us in?
The keys to whatever cell, whatever bars you find yourself behind are not the keys that unlock the door. It's the purpose that unlocks the meaning of life. That's the key that unlocks the door, not the one that gets you out of the prison, but the one that gets you into your meaning and that's your purpose. Go after your purpose like your life depends on it, because it does. Go after your purpose every day.
Tim, thank you so much for taking the time, obviously for blessing us. Bro, you know I love you, right?
Hey, you know I love you, right?
I do. Thank you, Tim. Thanks for joining us. Be blessed.
All right.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to this episode of Get Uncomfortable. Get Uncomfortable is produced in partnership between me, Rachel Hansen, and Adam Smith. If you want to hear more from Adam, visit his website, hearadamspeak.com, where you can book him to speak at your organization and hear more about what he has to say about what we talk about here on the show. Now, if you want to support the show itself, there are a variety of ways that you can do that. You can leave us a review anywhere you listen to podcasts, send us an email, or share an episode with a friend. Until next time, stay uncomfortable.